Your grandmother's estate is bankrupt. Actually, it's worse than bankrupt, it's in the negative. My Uncle Vernon said those words to me across a mahogany table in a law office that smelled like old paper and expensive cologne. His face was arranged in what I suppose he thought was sympathy, but his eyes, cold and calculating, told a different story entirely. I was 26 years old, sitting in a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly rent, being told that the woman who raised me had left me nothing but problems. The medical bills alone, my Aunt Patricia chimed in, dabbing at eyes that weren't actually wet, they just piled up at the end. You know how it was. I did know how it was. I'd been there. I'd held my grandmother's hand through 3 years of treatments, through the hospital visits, through the long nights when she couldn't sleep. My aunt and uncle? They'd visited maybe 4 times total. We've already handled the debts, Vernon continued, sliding a document across the table. Out of our own pockets, of course. Family takes care of family. We just need you to sign this release so we can finalize everything. The paper was dense with legal language, but one phrase jumped out at me: full and complete release of all claims to the estate of Margaret Elizabeth Holloway. You want me to sign away my inheritance, I said slowly, for an estate you're telling me is worthless. It's just a formality. Vernon's smile didn't reach his eyes. Purely procedural. Something cold settled in my stomach. My grandmother had been many things: stubborn, fiercely independent, sharp as a tack until the very end, but financially irresponsible wasn't one of them. This woman had survived the Depression as a child, had pinched pennies like they were made of gold, had lectured me countless times about saving for the future. And they expected me to believe she died $73,000 in debt? I need to think about it, I said, standing up. Vernon's face flickered, just for a second, with something that looked a lot like panic. There's really nothing to think about, Elijah. The estate's been valued, the debts have been calculated. I said I need to think about it. I walked out of that office with the document still unsigned on the table and a certainty growing in my chest that I was being played. What you need to understand about my grandmother is that she was the last keeper of our family history. Her house, the house I'd grown up visiting every summer, the house that smelled like lavender and old books, was a museum of memories. Photographs from generations back. Letters tied with faded ribbons. Boxes of documents in the attic that hadn't been opened in decades. Vernon and Patricia had been pressuring her to sell that house for years. It's too much for you to maintain, they'd argue during their rare visits. You should move into assisted living. We could help manage the proceeds. She'd always refused. That house holds secrets, she'd told me once, when I was maybe 17. We were sitting on her porch, watching fireflies blink in the summer darkness. Secrets that certain people in this family would prefer stayed buried. I'd asked her what she meant, but she'd just smiled that mysterious smile of hers and changed the subject. Now, sitting in my apartment 3 days after that meeting in the law office, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Secrets that certain people would prefer stayed buried. I called the law firm handling the estate. Not Uncle Vernon's lawyer, the one my grandmother had used for years. A woman named Susan Prescott who'd known my grandmother for 3 decades. I was wondering when you'd call, she said, and something in her voice made my heart beat faster. What do you mean? I mean your grandmother gave me very specific instructions before she passed. She told me that when you called, and she was certain you would, I was to tell you one thing. I held my breath. She said, tell Elijah to look behind Great Aunt Josephine. Great Aunt Josephine was a photograph. A formal portrait from 1924 of a woman I'd never met, my grandmother's aunt, who had died young under circumstances no one ever talked about. That photograph had hung in the same spot in my grandmother's house for as long as I could remember, above the fireplace in the back parlor. The room that was always locked and that we children had been forbidden from entering. The house was supposed to be in probate, but I still had my old key. I still remembered which floorboard creaked by the back door and which window never quite latched properly. I went at night. I'm not proud of that, but I also wasn't willing to alert Vernon and Patricia to what I was doing. Not yet. Not until I knew what I was dealing with. The house felt different in the darkness, smaller somehow, and sadder. The furniture was already covered with dust sheets, and someone had started packing up the smaller items. Vernon's work, no doubt, eager to liquidate everything. I found the parlor door unlocked. Someone had already been in here, going through the antique desk, pulling books off the shelves. But the photograph of Great Aunt Josephine still hung above the fireplace, undisturbed. Look behind Great Aunt Josephine. I lifted the heavy frame off its hook and turned it over. The backing was old cardboard, yellowed with age. I almost missed it, a slight bulge, a place where the cardboard didn't lie quite flat. My hands were shaking as I carefully pried up the edge of the backing. Behind the photograph, pressed flat and preserved for nearly a century, was an envelope. Inside the envelope was a letter dated June 3, 1924, and a document that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The letter was written in faded ink, the handwriting elegant and old-fashioned. It was from my great-great-grandfather, a man named Samuel Holloway, addressed to his daughter Josephine, the same Josephine whose portrait had guarded this secret for 100 years. My dearest daughter, the letter began, I am entrusting you with the protection of something that will secure our family's future for generations to come. The trust one have established is irrevocable and is designed to pass to the eldest child of each generation until such time as the principal is to be distributed in full in the year 2025, 100 years from its establishment. My hands went cold. A trust. A century-old trust that was set to mature in 2025, just 1 year away. The accompanying document was the original trust instrument, signed by Samuel Holloway and witnessed by a bank officer and a notary. The language was dense and archaic, but the meaning was clear. Samuel had established a trust with the First National Bank of Philadelphia in 1925. Funded with what was then a substantial sum, $50,000 in cash plus shares in several companies plus a portfolio of properties across 3 states. And according to the terms of the trust, it was to pass from eldest child to eldest child, accumulating value, until its 100th anniversary. At which point, the entire principal, whatever it had grown to over a century, would be distributed to the current beneficiary. My grandmother had been an only child. My mother had been her only child. And I was my mother's only child. I was the beneficiary of a trust that had been growing, compound interest upon compound interest, investment upon investment, for nearly 100 years. And my aunt and uncle, who were related to my grandmother only through marriage, through my grandfather's side, had been trying to get me to sign away all claims to it. Here's what I learned over the following weeks, as I dug deeper into the secret my grandmother had been protecting. The trust hadn't just sat in a bank account collecting interest. Samuel Holloway had been a shrewd businessman, a partner in one of the early steel companies, an investor in railroads and real estate. The trust had been managed according to his careful instructions, diversified across industries, reinvested and grown by successive generations of bank trustees. The First National Bank of Philadelphia no longer existed, it had been absorbed into larger banks through decades of mergers and acquisitions. But the trust had survived each transition, its records meticulously maintained, its investments carefully managed. And its current value? $14.7 million. I sat in the office of a trust attorney I'd hired, paying him with the last of my savings and a promise of future compensation, and stared at the number on the document in front of me. The bank has been trying to locate the current beneficiary for years, the attorney, a gray-haired man named William Chen, explained. The problem is that the trust was so old, and family records were incomplete. They knew the general outline, that it was supposed to pass to the eldest child of each generation, but tracking the actual lineage proved difficult. How is it possible that no one knew about this? I asked. Wouldn't there have been distributions, communications, something? That's the interesting part. William leaned forward. There were communications. Annual statements sent to the beneficiary of record. In the 1990s, when your mother was the beneficiary, those statements were being sent to an address in Ohio. My mother had never lived in Ohio. And from 2008 onwards, after your mother passed away and the trust should have transferred to you, the statements were being sent to a post office box in New Jersey. New Jersey. Where Vernon and Patricia lived. They knew, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. They've known for decades. It appears that way. Your grandfather's family seems to have been aware of the trust, even though they weren't the beneficiaries. And when your grandmother's health began to decline, they saw an opportunity. To steal $14 million. To appropriate an inheritance that was never legally theirs. But they made a critical error. William smiled grimly. They never actually had access to the trust itself. The bank wouldn't release funds without proper verification of beneficiary status. All they could do was intercept the communications and try to ensure that the real beneficiaries, first your mother, then you, never learned of the trust's existence. And if they'd gotten me to sign that release, they would have used it to claim that you'd voluntarily given up your rights. They probably had a forged beneficiary document ready to present to the bank. It would have been messy, and it might not have worked, but with you out of the picture and your grandmother gone, they would have had a much better chance of pulling it off. The confrontation came on a sunny afternoon in June, in the same law office where Vernon had tried to get me to sign away my birthright. But this time, I was the one who'd called the meeting. Vernon and Patricia arrived looking confident, probably assuming I'd finally caved and was ready to sign their paperwork. Their smiles faltered when they saw William sitting beside me, a folder of documents on the table in front of us. What's this about, Elijah? Patricia asked, her voice sharp. I thought we were here to finalize the estate. We are, I said. Just not the way you expected. I slid the first document across the table, a copy of the 1925 trust instrument. Vernon's face went white. Actually white, like all the blood had drained out of it in an instant. Patricia snatched up the paper, scanned it, and her hand started to shake. That's not, where did you, this doesn't prove anything, she stammered. It proves that my great-great-grandfather established a trust in 1925, I said calmly. It proves that the trust was designed to pass to the eldest child of each generation. It proves that I am the current and legitimate beneficiary. I slid the second document across. This is the bank's certification of the trust's current value. $14.7 million. Patricia made a sound like she was choking. And this, I continued, sliding a third document across the table, is a record of the trust's communication history. Annual statements sent to my mother's address in Ohio, an address she never lived at. Statements sent to your post office box after she died. Strange, don't you think, that you would be receiving mail about a trust you claim to know nothing about? Vernon found his voice. This is ridiculous. You're making wild accusations. I'm stating facts, Uncle Vernon. Facts that I've already shared with the bank's legal team, my own attorneys, and, as of this morning, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard. Mail fraud is a federal offense, William added helpfully. So is attempted theft of inheritance. The bank is pursuing its own investigation into how their communications were intercepted for over 2 decades. And of course, there's the matter of the statements you made to my client about the estate being bankrupt, statements that you knew to be false. Patricia burst into tears, real ones this time. Vernon just sat there, frozen, his face cycling through expressions like he couldn't decide whether to be angry or terrified. You can't prove anything, he finally said, but his voice had no conviction in it. Actually, we can prove quite a lot. I leaned forward. But here's the interesting thing, Uncle Vernon. I'm not actually interested in sending you to prison. I'm not interested in dragging our family's name through the courts for years. I'm just interested in what's rightfully mine. I pulled out one final document and set it in front of him. This is a full confession. It admits to your role in concealing the trust's existence and in attempting to fraudulently obtain my inheritance. Sign it, and I'll ask the bank and the FBI to show leniency. Refuse, and we go to trial, where every sordid detail of what you've done will become public record. Patricia was sobbing now, makeup running down her face in dark streaks. Vernon stared at the confession like it was a snake that might bite him. This isn't fair, he whispered. I thought about all the years my mother had struggled financially, never knowing there was a fortune waiting for her. I thought about my grandmother, burdened with a secret she couldn't share, watching her in-laws circle like vultures. I thought about the man who tried to make me sign away my legacy with lies about debt and bankruptcy. No, I said quietly. It wasn't. Vernon signed. The aftermath wasn't as dramatic as the confrontation itself. Vernon and Patricia faced significant legal consequences despite my request for leniency. The FBI and the bank had their own interests to pursue, and mail fraud is taken seriously by federal prosecutors. They received suspended sentences, heavy fines, and the kind of public humiliation that comes from having your crimes reported in the local newspaper. They sold their fancy house in New Jersey to pay their legal fees. I heard they moved to a small apartment in a town where nobody knew them. I can't say I felt sorry for them. As for me, the money was life-changing, obviously. But what changed me more profoundly wasn't the dollar amount. It was the process of uncovering the truth, of understanding my family history in ways I never had before. My great-great-grandfather Samuel Holloway had built his fortune through decades of hard work and careful investment. He'd created the trust not just as a way to pass on wealth but as a test, a way of ensuring that his descendants would have to be patient to think long-term to value the future as much as the present. My great-aunt Josephine, the woman in the photograph, had been the first guardian of the secret. She died young, of tuberculosis, I learned, but not before ensuring that the trust documents were hidden safely, preserved for future generations. My grandmother had spent her entire life protecting that legacy. She'd endured Vernon and Patricia's constant pressure, their barely concealed greed, their attempts to get her to sell the house where the secret was hidden. She'd never wavered, never told them what she knew, never gave them the satisfaction of knowing how close they were to a fortune they'd never deserve. And in the end, she'd trusted me to figure it out. She'd known I would call Susan Prescott. She'd known I would follow the clue about Great-Aunt Josephine. She'd known that the same stubbornness and curiosity she'd nurtured in me as a child would lead me to the truth. I like to think she's somewhere, watching, satisfied that her trust in me wasn't misplaced. If you're watching this and you're dealing with your own family inheritance, let me share some of what I learned. First, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if the explanations don't add up, if people are pressuring you to sign documents quickly, if family members who never seem to care suddenly become very interested in estate matters, pay attention to that feeling. It exists for a reason. Second, do your research. Family secrets have a way of hiding in plain sight. Old letters, photographs, documents that everyone's ignored for decades, they can contain information that changes everything. Don't assume you know your family's full history just because you grew up hearing the same stories. Third, get professional help. I couldn't have navigated the legal complexities of a century-old trust on my own. Finding the right attorney, someone who specialized in trust law and had experience with historical estates, made all the difference. Fourth, document everything. Keep records of conversations, save emails and letters, note dates and times. If you end up needing to prove fraud or deception, those details matter. And finally, don't let anyone make you feel guilty for claiming what's yours. Vernon and Patricia tried to frame me as greedy, as disrespectful to my grandmother's memory, as tearing the family apart. But the truth is that they were the ones who'd been stealing from our family for decades. I was just setting things right. What am I doing with the inheritance? Some of it's invested, following my great-great-grandfather's example. Some of it went to causes my grandmother cared about, literacy programs, libraries, scholarships for first-generation college students. Some of it went to restoring her house, which I couldn't bring myself to sell. It's mine now, filled with family history and secrets and memories of the woman who raised me. I go there on summer evenings sometimes. I sit on the porch where my grandmother and I watched fireflies. I look at the photograph of Great Aunt Josephine, now hanging in a place of honor where visitors can see it. And I think about what my grandmother told me all those years ago. That the house held secrets. That certain people in the family would prefer they stayed buried. She was right about everything. She was right that the secrets would come out eventually. She was right that the truth would set things right. And she was right to trust me with the family legacy. My bankrupt inheritance turned out to be worth millions. But the real treasure wasn't the money. It was understanding where I came from, who my family really was, and what it means to fight for what's rightfully yours. Sometimes the best stories are the ones your family tried to hide. And sometimes, if you're stubborn enough and curious enough and just a little bit lucky, you get to be the one who brings them into the light. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I've got more stories about family secrets, hidden legacies, and the moments that change everything. And if you've got your own story about uncovering family truths, drop it in the comments below. You never know who might need to hear it.